My name is Elaine Parker, and on our 30th wedding anniversary, I watched my husband stand beneath a chandelier, tap his glass with a fork, and tell a room full of family and friends I'm starting a new life. Without you. The band froze on a half note. Silverware hovered midair. Then he turned and kissed the woman in the red dress, his mistress, in front of our sons, our pastor, and the neighbors, who've known us since Little League. I raised my glass, the stem cool between my fingers, and said, steady as a church bell, enjoy it. After tonight, you belong to the police. The quiet after a public betrayal isn't empty. It fills with tiny sounds. A chair leg scraped. Someone coughed and then coughed again. Ice settled in a water glass with a click like a small clock. The cake, 3 white tears with sugar roses, waited on a side table like a promise that wouldn't be cut. Under the chandelier, the brass from the American Legion trio shone without moving. A camera light died, and shame arrived right on time. If you'd asked me that morning what I expected, I would have said a slideshow of photographs, a blessing from our pastor, a slow dance to the same song we chose in 1995 when the DJ still worked off CDs. I ironed Hal's shirt and my navy dress, pinned on my mother's pearls, and chose low heels because floors like this punish the proud. Our sons Michael and David teased me about packing extra tissues. I thought we'd laugh over the wallpaper we once chose in a burst of optimism in the station wagon that lived longer than any mechanic predicted. Hal, no one calls him Harold, has always wanted an audience. In the early years, his stage was the Little League field and the church picnic. He carved brisket like a hero and told stories with himself in the center. Later, he loved company Christmas parties where his speeches ran longer than the bonuses. I learned to be the quiet under his thunder. It seemed fair enough marriages make room for a lead and a harmony. The woman in red never let go of his arm. I didn't know her name yet. I knew her perfume the mall in December and the shine of her manicure. She glanced at me like a realtor measuring square footage with her eyes. We've had a good run, Hal said into the microphone as if I were across a football field and not 5 tables away. I'm choosing happiness. That word snagged in my throat. For 3 decades, happiness had looked like a winter furnace that barely held on coupons clipped at the kitchen table and the two of us painting room by room until our wrists ached. Michael rose an inch from his chair, a lineman, ready for the snap. I lifted a finger and he sat. David found my hand beneath the tablecloth and squeezed once the way he did during thunderstorms when he was 10. Mrs. Delaney from our pew covered her mouth. Her husband studied the light fixtures as if they kept instructions. In the corner, the banquet manager calmed the way nurses are calm glided toward the door. The DJ watched her for a signal and received none. I wish I could say my words about the police were born out of sudden anger, but the truth is slower than that, and much less theatrical. The first time I thought something might be criminal was 3 springs ago, when a vendor called about an invoice paid to a new account. I keep the files. I'm the woman who can find a warranty from 2009 in under a minute. There was no letter from the bank, just a vague email from Hal about streamlining. It didn't smell like bad bookkeeping. It smelled like a plan. Waiting is not the same as doing nothing. On Tuesdays, I volunteer at the senior center. A retired detective teaches a class on scams. I brought brownies and listened. He said mistakes drift, patterns march. Money moves like water, and diversion leaves a wet edge somewhere. I called a lawyer I trust, the same woman who sat with me during my sister's surgery and never looked at the clock. She told me to stop guessing and start documenting. Save emails. Note dates. Don't confront. Collect. So I did. I smiled through Thanksgiving with the good china while spreadsheets slept in a manila folder under the bed. I made small talk with the red dress woman at the hardware store. When I ran into them, Hal called her a client as if the word could erase lipstick. I packed him picnic lunches for supplier meetings and logged the mileage when he borrowed my car. When he gave me a diamond bracelet our budget could not afford, I thanked him, closed the clasp, and slid the box into the safe deposit drawer the next morning. By the time the invitation for the anniversary party arrived, with gold script and a photograph of us at the county fair, I knew more than I wanted to know. I knew which vendor had been paid twice and which not at all. I knew the small credit union where a new account had bloomed. I knew the date a county contract was awarded to Hal's company and the days when money went missing afterward. Public funds behave differently. When they disappear, they tend to bring people in Navy windbreakers to your door. My lawyer made the calls that needed making. I came tonight in a navy dress and pearls and with a folder in the trunk of my car that could stop a marching band. So when Hal took the microphone and chose humiliation like it was an hors d'oeuvre, I didn't have to search for courage. It was already laid out beside the silverware. I stood steady inside myself. I lifted my glass and let the words come not shouted, not cruel, simply placed where everyone could hear them. Enjoy it. After tonight, you belong to the police. The room moved the way a flock lifts when a hawk crosses a field. Heads turned toward the doorway. The woman in red blinked and loosened her grip an inch. Hal's mouth opened and then forgot its lines. The chandelier hummed, or maybe that was only my blood. In the window's dark pane, I saw someone I recognized and almost didn't, a woman small and still and unbroken. A draft slipped in from the hallway and bent the candle flames toward me. The banquet manager stepped aside. A pair of silhouettes paused at the threshold, cut from the cooler light outside the room, and Hal followed those shapes with his eyes dragging the whole crowd's attention the same direction. His face went the color of an unmarked envelope. I set my glass on the linen and stood. Chairs trembled against the floor. My sons rose too, not to rescue me. No one needed rescuing but to stand shoulder to shoulder. People will tell this story later and add things I never said and expressions I never wore. They'll say I practiced my line in the mirror and smirked when I said it. They'll say Hal didn't understand until the handcuffs clicked. None of that is true. The truth is simpler and to me kinder. I didn't come to break him. I came because 30 years is a long, real thing, and when a long thing ends, you dress in navy and pearls and say thank you for the honest parts. But truth has its own posture, and tonight it stood up straight. Stood up. The bandleader coughed into his sleeve. A fork slid off a plate and rang like a bell. I smoothed my skirt and breathed in the faint citrus from the centerpiece. Outside, traffic moved past the Knights of Columbus Hall toward the grocery store and the high school football field. Life went on politely beyond our party, while the air inside held still and thin. Hal cleared his throat and tried on his salesman's grin, but it fit wrong. Elaine, he said, and for the first time in years, he sounded like a man who had misplaced his script. What are you doing? What I was doing was standing upright. What I was doing was letting silence do the heavy lifting. I touched the back of my chair with my fingertips the way you touch a rail before you take the stairs. I kept my eyes on him, not the doorway, because I wanted him to understand that whatever came next did not come from a stranger. It came from a wife who keeps the files, remembers where the money went, and refuses to be made a fool. I waited. The candles trembled and then steadied. The room breathed once together. I did not learn to be calm in a ballroom. I learned it over a simmering pot while the dryer thumped and the dog scratched to be let out. Before the chandelier and the microphone and the red dress ordinary Tuesdays taught me how to breathe through insult and keep my hands steady. The first shift came small, like a seam rip you notice only in sunlight. Hal started staying late at the warehouse and called it quarter end. He came home with a smell I couldn't place, lemon and a little smoke, and laughed more softly at the boys' jokes, as if he were listening from another room. The TV volume crept higher. The thermostat slipped cooler, as though the house itself were bracing. We were not fancy people. Our mortgage fit our paychecks if we minded coupons and watched the electric bill. Saturdays were for Costco runs and churchyard work. Sundays for potlucks where someone always brought deviled eggs, and I always brought green beans with bacon because Mrs. Delaney said mine were the only ones that stayed crisp. I kept ledgers in a spiral notebook with a tab for each month and a strip of tape for any receipt that tried to wander. Hal used to tease me kindly, CPA Parker, and kiss my forehead when I balanced the checkbook to the penny. After Michael left for college and David started nights at the hospital, the house grew too quiet, in a way noise couldn't fix. I turned on call-in shows about Roth IRAs and long-term care insurance and learned what a roof ought to cost per square. I mention this because marriage is a long business as well as a long love, and the columns must add up. When they don't, something wobbles under your feet. Receipts appeared from restaurants we never visited, white tablecloth places with valet stands where desserts are described by word count. Hal said vendors preferred off-site meetings, and I wanted to believe him. One night, I scrubbed lipstick from his shirt collar a shade too orange for my face. He laughed and said the sales office had a costume box for a birthday. That was March. By June, his phone began sleeping face down on the counter like a turtle retracting. Our pastor preached a summer series on kindness. In the margins, I wrote, patience is not permission. Gentleness is not blindness. In July, the bank called to verify a transfer I didn't recognize. Hal said he moved money to simplify. I told myself married people sometimes have to trust before they understand. We had 29 Thanksgiving turkeys together. The 30th, he announced he would swing by after a client meeting. The boys and I ate without him and wrapped a plate in foil. He came home at 10 wearing cologne I hadn't gifted and kissed the air beside my cheek. When he showered, I took his suit jacket to the laundry room and found a hotel key in the pocket. I set it on the washer lid and watched it blink blue like the world had learned a new cruel way to say maybe. I did not throw a fit. I baked a pie for the church raffle and learned the name of the new receptionist at the shop and asked after her grandmother's hip. This is the part of the story people hurry past because it doesn't sparkle the slow training of your mouth to say while your brain starts building shelves. I slid a manila folder into the bottom drawer by the spare light bulbs. I wrote dates on an index card and tucked it into the cookbook I opened most. I created a second, quieter email address and forwarded myself anything that felt slippery. My sister Ruth said, "You can't make a man love you right." I said I can decide whether I lose myself along with my marriage. She dropped off a casserole and hugged me longer than usual. When you're over 60, the women around you have seen enough to speak in plain weather words. She did not say leave. She said keep your name, keep your credit. At the senior center, the retired detective held up a grocery gift card and explained how scammers drain it before you get home. Patterns, he said. Follow them. He showed us how to spot a fake invoice. I wrote down the phrase public funds and underlined it twice. At home, I opened the file for Hal's company contracts and looked not at the top lines but the ledger codes far to the right where clerks hide their headaches. I saw overpayments that didn't return late fees that never should have existed and a new vendor with a name that matched a mailbox store near the bypass. The night I asked Hal if he wanted coffee after dinner, he said he was cutting caffeine, then reached for the energy drink in the garage fridge. I stood at the sink washing the Dutch oven and thought about how people tell the truth by accident, their mouths choosing one story while their hands confess another. New shirts appeared with brand names stitched tiny on the cuff, the kind that arrive in boxes with tissue. He carried a gym bag for early workouts, though his belt notches moved the wrong direction. On our street, Mrs. Lang's maple turned early red by Labor Day. The neighbor boys raked leaves into piles and jumped until they disappeared. I pulled the geranium set, mums by the porch steps, and in the car on the way to Kroger, practiced saying I know and practice saying no and practice saying nothing at all. When a marriage tips, you must be careful where you put your feet. Panic will have you sprinting. Dignity walks. Hal began correcting my memory at dinner, telling stories as if I hadn't been there. We met the Burkes at the July cookout, he'd say, when we'd met them in May at Michael's game. It is a small violence that rewriting and it works on you like erosion. I started recording the truth on my calendar squares with a pencil. When he was late on a Wednesday, I noted it. When he said he'd be out of town, I asked for the hotel, and when he said, just a roadside place, I wrote just a roadside place and circled it. In October, the company mailed a glossy postcard celebrating 30 years of excellence. Our faces beamed from a photo taken years earlier when my hair was darker and Hal still touched my elbow out of habit. I stuck the card on the fridge with the plumber's magnet, the one with the emergency number. It looked like a prayer and a warning in the same breath. I made an appointment with the lawyer and brought cookies because she forgets to eat lunch. She told me which questions I was allowed to ask and which I should not. She explained that criminal and civil are different roads that sometimes intersect at a single light. Your job, she said, is to be brave and boring. Document. Don't dramatize. If a thing is true, it will stand without adjectives. So I learned to be boring in the way that saves your life. I copied statements, I printed emails. I kept the bracelet he bought me in its velvet box, not out of sentiment, but because assets are a language courts understand. I did not accuse him of anything. I did not ask where he was going when he left in the new shirt smelling like the mall in December. I watered the spider plant, took soup to the widow down the block, and tucked $10 a week into an envelope marked emergency, though by then the emergency had already announced itself. The winter before the anniversary, Hal stood in the doorway with his coat still on and said, I feel like I'm missing out. I looked at him and said, on what he didn't answer. He put his keys in the bowl and turned on the game. Missing out is a story men tell when what they mean is they want applause. I folded towels warm from the dryer and counted them the way I count stitches when I mend. If you've lived long enough, you know craving applause can make a fool of a man faster than despair. By spring, I had enough notes to braid into a rope. I did not plan a spectacle. I planned to survive with my face intact. When the gold script invitation arrived for the anniversary party, I set it on the counter beside the coupons and the prayer list from church. I RSVP'd yes, ironed my navy dress, and checked the folder in the bottom drawer. The papers didn't look like drama. They looked like paper. But if you held them to the light, you could see the pattern marching. Her name arrived the way names do in small towns on a receipt. I was at the hardware store buying furnace filters when the clerk, a high school kid with a cowlick and a sincere smile, rang up a quart of Dextain for the woman in line ahead of me. "That'll do it, Ms. Tessa," he said. She wore a red knit top under a camel coat and laughed like she'd just remembered a private joke. When she turned to leave, her perfume touched the Air Mall in December, the same one that rode home on Hal's jacket. She held the door for me and looked me up and down the way you measure wall space. "Cute scarf," she said, and left with a click of heels. I carried my filters to the car and sat a minute while the defroster cleared a fan of frost from the windshield. Tessa. A name you can say without moving your jaw much. On the passenger seat, my list for the Day Bank Deposit Senior Center Cookies Roots prescription pickup. I wrote Tessa on the margin and circled it, not to keep her, but to keep the truth of her. If a thing is true, my lawyer said it won't mind being written down. You would think the first sighting of the woman who helps dismantle your life would break you into operatic pieces. It did not. It felt like finally hearing the faint hum you've sensed for months and realizing it was the refrigerator. A disappointment and a relief. I put the car in drive and went on with Tuesday. Tessa began appearing in town the way new paint does on corners you pass daily without noticing until one morning you do. She picked up a Togo latte from the cafe, where the owner knows our orders by heart. She stood at the dry cleaner's counter, flipping through a rack of shirts wrapped in thin plastic. At the florist, I watched her count stems and wrap a ribbon around a bouquet with hands that looked practiced. She saw me watching and smiled with a precision that said this wasn't her first parade. At church, Mrs. Delaney whispered that a new gal had been joining the Friday Zumba group at the Y. Very flexible, she said, lowering her eyebrows the way older women do when they want to be kind and sharp at once. I nodded and passed her the pen to sign the casserole schedule. The gossip did not come like a flood. It came in teaspoons stirred into ordinary talk until the flavor changed. Hal insisted Tessa was a client. I let the word hang like a paper star at Christmas, decorative, temporary, flimsy if you breathe too hard. When he said he had to meet the client at a restaurant uptown to go over a bid, I asked if he wanted me to iron his blue shirt. He looked surprised, then relieved like a boy whose mother has volunteered to drive him to the dance. He wore the good watch and left with a whistle he hadn't used in years. I stood at the window long enough to see his taillights disappear and then texted Ruth going out. She replied with a single heart in the name of a bail bondsman, a joke with an edge. I laughed. Humor is just grief wearing comfortable shoes. I ran into Tessa again, at the big box store near the bypass. She had a cart with a blender, a throw pillow, and 2 picture frames that said family in block letters. She turned down the lighting aisle and nearly collided with me. "You must be Elaine," she said, as if we were in a book club. "Hal speaks so highly of your..." And there she paused, hunting the word like a bird hunts a shiny bit stability. I could have given her other words, grit, patience, spine. I kept those for myself. We all do what we can, I said. She took that as agreement. People think a mistress will look like the magazine version, reckless and windblown lipstick like a siren. Tessa looked like someone who reads catalogs and folds the dog hair out of sweaters. She wasn't spectacular, she was deliberate. Deliberate is more dangerous. It gives a man the illusion that the disassembling is normal, even responsible, like reorganizing a pantry. At the senior center, the retired detective taught us about affinity fraud. They don't con strangers, he said. They con the people who feel like cousins. He talked about false vendors and the beauty of dull names. I thought of the mailbox store by the bypass and the invoices with clean fonts and no dust on them. I baked an extra batch of snickerdoodles and left one on his desk with a note. What happens if the wrong money moves? He wrote back. It finds its way to the right people eventually. Bring your notes. I watched Tessa perform kindness in public the way women learn to do to keep a town from turning on them. She chatted with the Girl Scouts selling cookies outside Kroger and bought an armful of Thin Mints. She donated a basket to the Rotary silent auction with artisanal olive oil and a candle that smelled like laundry. At the pet shelter fundraiser, she put her hand on Hal's sleeve when he reached for his wallet and murmured something that made him grin. They were building a vocabulary. You can tell by how people move around each other when they think no one's watching. It's a choreography of permission. At home, I swept the kitchen floor and found glitter near the back door a party left on the soles of someone's shoes. I swept it into the dustpan and felt for the first time a flare of something hot. It wasn't jealousy. It was the insult of being asked to clean the evidence of my own erasure. I dumped the glitter in the trash and wiped the counter with slow, precise strokes until the laminate shone. Then I pulled out the folder from the bottom drawer and added a page. Date. Time. Charge from Hyde's Steakhouse, 2 entrees, 2 cocktails, tip generous. I stapled the small credit union's routing number beside it and drew a line that connected one to the other. If a thing is true, it belongs on paper. The women at church began speaking to me in weather. Rough patch unseasonable. You know we're here. I thanked them and declined invitations until the invitations grew fewer and warmer, the way soup does when it cools. A friend who had lived through her own storm took me to the cemetery, and we walked the rows reading names out loud. Say what was good, she told me, and let the rest lie. I said he held my hair when I was sick with Michael. He painted the nursery yellow because I wanted yellow even though it was on sale in blue. He shoveled every neighbor's sidewalk, the blizzard of our '03. It helped. It didn't fix. Tessa tried condescension the next time we met. At the UPS store, I was shipping a care package socks and instant ramen to David on a long week. She came in behind me with a glossy envelope and said, "It takes a certain kind of woman to keep a household running. Not everyone can evolve." She tilted her head like a newscaster offering condolences. I thought of our pastor's sermon, "Gentleness is not blindness." I said, "You're right. Not everyone can." She blinked. It turns out steadiness sounds like threat to people who survive on Flash. Hal began bringing her to places where our life had worn grooves for decades. The Saturday diner, the hardware store, the park, where we took the boys to feed ducks. The first time they sat at our booth, the waitress got their order wrong. Muscle memory trumping novelty. Hal made a joke about old habits. Tessa laughed politely, then folded her straw wrapper into a little bow and left it on the table like a claim. I paid our mortgage that afternoon and wrote the confirmation number in 3 places. If a man wants to turn your life into theater, give the stage manager a ledger. I told Ruth. She thinks she's winning because she gets the candlelit restaurants while I get the bills. Ruth, who is twice widowed and has learned to plant tomatoes the day after a funeral because hands need dirt, said, "Let her have the candlelight. You keep the switch." Then she handed me a packet of heirloom seeds. You'll want something to look forward to come spring. One ordinary Thursday, as I loaded groceries into the trunk, Tessa rolled up in a car I knew from Hal's new fleet account. She leaned on the door and said lightly, "He says you're very practical. Men need magic." Somewhere in the parking lot, a cart boy whistled an off-key tune. I let her words settle like dust and then said, "Magic is what people call discipline when they don't want to practice." She smiled too wide and drove off. It would be cleaner to say I hated her. I didn't. She was a symptom. The sickness lived in Hal in the way he needed a spotlight and an echo. But symptoms can still spread if you aren't careful. I washed my hands of explanation. I spoke less and wrote more. I learned the clerk's name at the small credit union and what days the manager took lunch. I noted how the city website posted contracts and which words reappeared. Patterns marched. I marched with them. By the time the invitations went out for the anniversary party, with that gold script that pretends to be permanent, I knew Tessa would wear red. It is a costume color bold and obvious, meant to force the room to look and keep looking. I chose navy. Navy is for people who do not need to be seen to be certain. I ironed my dress. I polished my mother's pearls. I slid the manila folder into the trunk beneath the picnic blanket. And the set of jumper cables Hal never remembers we own. Then I stood at the mirror and practiced breathing until my face learned calm again. The last week before the party, I saw Tessa at the salon when I stopped in to buy hairspray. She sat under the dryer, waving her fingers to dry polish. "Big weekend," she asked, eyes bright with theater lights. "Anniversaries are such transitions." I said yes and paid for my can. On the drive home, the radio played at last, the song we danced to once in a gymnasium decorated with crepe paper and hope. I pulled into the driveway and turned the key, letting the quiet arrive fully. I looked at the maple beside the porch, last leaves clinging like stubborn coins, and understood that what I felt wasn't defeat, it was readiness. The day I stopped guessing and started knowing began with a shoebox and a pot of soup. I was stirring chicken noodle for Ruth. She'd caught a cold that wouldn't let go when I slid the shoebox onto the kitchen table and tipped out what I'd been keeping flat and quiet copies of invoices, bank screenshots, my neat pencil notes on index cards with dates, and the small, stubborn facts that make up a life. Steam fogged the window. The dog thumped her tail. I laid everything out in rows like quilt pieces waiting their turn. I called my lawyer and asked if she had time for a kitchen visit. She arrived at 4 with wet hair and a legal pad, sat at my table, and listened the way good people listen, without arranging my story into a shape that fit their own needs. When she finished scanning the copies, she tapped the page where I'd circled the name of the new vendor with the mailbox store address. "This isn't sloppiness," she said. "It's intent." She explained words that carry weight in courtrooms: misappropriation, falsified records, public corruption. I felt an old teacher's calm settle over me. Names help a person stand up straighter. We talked about what kind of money changes a thing from private badness to public crime. Hal's company had landed a county contract to retrofit streetlights the year the council pushed for energy savings. I remembered because he'd brought home a brochure and asked me which font looked more municipal. In my folder were payments logged to the lighting project, and soon after, each transfers out to the small credit union account that bore a name I didn't recognize. The lawyer traced the path with her pen. "Public funds have stewards," she said, "and stewards have handcuffs when they forget what they are." She called a retired prosecutor she trusts the kind of woman who keeps color-coded tabs and laughs at black coffee. The prosecutor asked permission to loop in the county investigator and reminded us of the difference between gossip and evidence. "We don't need motive," she said. "We need math." I made a fresh pot of coffee and cut squares of lemon bar because feeding people is how I keep a room steady when it starts to tip. They spread my pages across the table and began to build a chain from invoice to transfer, from transfer to withdrawal, from withdrawal to a purchase that didn't belong. The retired detective from the senior center came by the next afternoon at the prosecutor's request and brought a portable scanner and a patience that could hush a storm. "Chain of custody," he said like a blessing. "From this point forward, we'll do the holding." He showed me how to initial the corner of each copy and date it, how to print headers on emails so no one could claim I'd trimmed context to fit my hope. He complimented my pencil habit. "Ink beams," he said, "pencil bends." We spoke softly the way people speak in hospitals and churches where the air is heavy with consequence. I learned to speak a new language quickly. HEH, beneficiary, sole member LLC. I learned how plausible lies look: a vendor name, one letter off from a legitimate supplier, an address that traces to a strip mall mailbox, an email that uses a free service because our company server is down. I learned how small the numbers could be and still add up to theft: 5,000 here, 8,000 there. Amounts that look like oversight until you add the column and find out it equals a truck, then a salary, then a year of a kid's college. I learned that pride makes crooks forget that ordinary women keep calendars and save receipts. I asked plain as a fence post, "What happens next?" The prosecutor didn't sugarcoat. "We build," she said. "Then we knock." She told me there would be interviews, that people who'd felt the hum of wrong but kept working to protect their mortgages would finally exhale. She warned me that Hal might try charm, then anger, then tears. Our job isn't to make him feel anything, she said. Our job is to bring the truth into the light. We set 2 goals: protect the public's money and protect my dignity. I cried for 5 minutes in the bathroom, where the boys kept their Band-Aids when they were small. Then I washed my face and came back with a tray of ice water. They asked if I wanted the arrest to happen at home or at work or quietly at the end of a driveway. I said I wanted it to happen safely. The investigator said there's no such thing as perfect timing, only clean timing. Public place, he mused, where he can't reach a shredder or a shipping box. I said there was a party coming. I did not pitch a scene. I described the layout, the doors, the number of guests, the presence of a pastor and a Knights of Columbus Hall manager who could keep people calm. The prosecutor's pencil paused above her pad. "We'll decide," she said, not unkindly. I nodded. My part was the telling, not the choreography. In the days that followed, I copied what they asked and didn't copy what they didn't. I baked for the senior center and watered the neighbor's mums when she visited her sister in Toledo. I took my dog for dawn walks and watched the sky decide its color. At night, I practiced the only line I knew I might need to say if my voice would carry: "Enjoy it. After tonight, you belong to the police." I didn't rehearse a triumphant tone. I rehearsed steadiness. Anger burns fast and leaves you thirsty. Steadiness pours itself a glass of water and waits. I did tell Michael and David that there might be a difficult moment at the party. I did not load them with details. They are grown men, but still my boys. I wanted them to come because joy belongs to them as much as pain does. Stand with me. That's all I said. Michael squeezed my shoulder and made a joke about tackling anybody who spilled wine on my dress. David asked if I needed him to drive. I told him I had that part handled. I remember thinking I have more parts handled than he knows. One afternoon, dropping off a tray of brownies at the senior center, I ran into the retired detective in the hallway. He lifted a palm in quiet greeting and said, "You're doing fine." I said, "I don't feel brave." He said, "Brave is a word you notice in the rear view." On the corkboard outside the multi-purpose room hung a flyer about avoiding romance scams. I pinned a sticky note beside it in my careful hand. Call your bank. Call your friend. Keep your notes. It was for the seniors and it was for me. On the morning of the party, I put the folder in the trunk the way you put a winter blanket there before the first snow, not because you want to use it, but because winter is a truth you respect. I checked the spare tire. I set out food for the dog and told her I'd be home late. I ironed my navy dress one more time and polished my mother's pearls with the soft cloth she'd kept in a teacup. I looked at my face in the mirror and saw the woman who taught herself to make gravy without lumps and to call the contractor back when his invoice didn't match his estimate. Competence isn't flashy. It's the reason lights come on when you flip a switch. Before I left, I called the banquet manager to confirm the table count. It would have been reasonable to ask about exits as a nervous hostess. I didn't. I thanked her for the gluten-free rolls because kindness begets kindness, and I wanted a room that could hold what was coming without tearing at the seams. Then I locked the back door, stepped into the autumn light, and drove to the Knights of Columbus Hall with my hands at 10 and 2, like the rules that keep us all alive. The prosecutor's office didn't tell me what hour they'd chosen. They didn't have to. It wasn't mine to hold. What I held was my line and my posture, and the knowledge that when truth arrives, it does not need a spotlight, it brings its own. I parked under the maple that had let go of most of its leaves and watched one bright leaf fall a quiet, ordinary exit. Then I picked up my purse, smoothed my skirt, and walked inside to greet the people who had come to celebrate 30 years, not knowing that we were also about to witness the end of a story that had gone on too long. We arrived before the rush so I could greet people without being startled by them. The Knights of Columbus Hall always smells faintly of lemon oil and coffee, and the parquet floor has a history of weddings, reunions, and bingo nights scrubbed into its seams. The banquet manager, a woman with a clipboard and a voice that could calm a marching band, showed me the seating chart. White linen, navy napkins, small arrangements of mums and eucalyptus that made the tables look cared for without trying too hard. I checked the place cards the way you check a child's jacket zipper before a field trip habit, not worry. The band set up in the corner, 3 men from the American Legion who play the standards so tenderly even the tough men get soft around the eyes. They tuned quietly while people filtered in with coats slung over their arms and hugs ready. Mrs. Delaney from church wore her good brooch and pressed my hands between hers. Coach Lang brought his wife and told the story of when Hal fixed the scoreboards in 002 so the rivalry game could go on. The boys shook hands down the line like candidates, close-cropped hair, clean ties, their politeness a kind of armor that steadied me. Hal arrived 10 minutes after me because he likes entrances. He wore the navy suit that says respectable, and the grin that says, the room belongs to him. Tessa floated in on his arm in a red dress that drank the light and a lipstick that declared boldness, as if boldness were a virtue by itself. She leaned into him, as if they shared a private transmission, a frequency not meant for ordinary radios. The first flutter of whispers rose and dissolved like a wind that changed its mind. We made the small talk that helps grown people stay upright traffic on Route 7. The new ramp at the library who is thinking about Florida for the winter, who has a grandson at Purdue. A slideshow of photographs warmed the far wall. Hal in a mullet and me with big sleeves at our wedding. The boys holding frogs at the reservoir, our first house with siding. We painted one long weekend. People clapped at the baby pictures the way crowds do when they are on your side. I felt the old sweetness, which is different from the new ache, and let both be true at once. Dinner was chicken marsala and a vegetarian option that actually had flavor. The rolls were warm, the butter soft. Somebody kept the coffee topped. The DJ announced we'd cut the cake after a few words. That phrase, a few words, is always dangerous when a person like Hal has found a microphone. He tapped his water glass with a fork higher, and the room stilled the way rooms do when a benediction is expected. I watched the way a nurse watches a patient about to stand for the first time after surgery alert, to the wobble ready to catch, unwilling to do the walking for them. Hal took the mic and thanked people he needed to thank for appearances, our pastor, the boys, the staff who'd done wonders on a modest budget. He told the story of our first apartment and the cockroach the size of a Buick, his favorite crowd pleaser. People laughed on cue. He said we had built 30 years of partnership, and I heard the careful way he said partnership, like a word from a brochure. Tessa stood 3 steps back, not hiding exactly, but curating the view. When you've lived in a town long enough, you can tell when a moment has been rehearsed. Then he did what men who crave applause do. He tried to bend the room to his script. He straightened his tie, looked at the ceiling as if consulting a muse, and said, "I've learned something important about happiness." He paused just long enough to invite agreement and then stepped off the safe path. "I'm starting a new life. Without you." In the second after a bomb is dropped, air holds all the shapes it knew before. The bandleader's mouth stayed open around a reed. A waiter's tray trembled like a level's bubble. Mrs. Delaney's hand climbed to her heart as if climbing a hill. The silence was so complete you could hear the chafing dish sterno hiss, that tiny blue insistence that heat is heat no matter the occasion. Hal turned still inside his fantasy and kissed Tessa full on the mouth. There are private kisses and public ones. This was the showy kind, the sort that tries to borrow legitimacy by happening near a chandelier. I saw Michael rise from his chair jaw, set shoulders ready, and I lifted a finger the way I did when he was 7, and considering a swing at a boy who'd shoved him. He read my hand and sat down. David's knee bounced under the table once and then stilled. I laced my fingers loosely in my lap and let my breath find its own rhythm. He returned to the mic flushed and certain. "We've had a good run," he said, as if our marriage were a county fair and not a covenant lived through root canals and snow shovels. "Elaine's been steady." He meant it as a pat on the head. He meant it as an epitaph. Somewhere by the doorway, the banquet manager took 2 steps forward and stopped the way you step toward a glass about to fall, ready to catch but unwilling to perform the clatter for it. I stood not because drama required it, but because dignity does. I felt the chair touch the backs of my knees, and the pearl clasp cool at the nape of my neck. When I lifted my glass, the stem kissed my ring with a high, clean sound. I did not look at Tessa, who was already practicing a face that would photograph well. I looked at the people who had paid for raffle tickets and casseroles with us for 3 decades, the ones who'd left flowers on our steps when my mother died. I gave my words to them. "Enjoy it," I said, and the word landed without bounce. "After tonight, you belong to the police." There are lines you plant in your mouth like bulbs hoping they'll bloom when the season is right. This one opened exactly on time. A fork slipped and chimed against tile. Someone inhaled hard enough to squeak. I felt the room tilt and then correct an old house settling back onto its joists. The pastor's eyes closed as if in prayer, then opened sharper than before. The DJ reached instinctively for the volume knob and then took his hand away. Hal laughed. He always tries laughter first, like a man tapping a machine to make it work, then watched the laughter die halfway out of his own throat. Color left his face, not dramatically, but as if a dimmer slid down. Tessa shifted, lifting her chin in tiny defiance, the sort a person uses when they've run out of better poses. The boys stood with me, one on each side, not to fight, but the way pillars hold up a porch while a storm figures itself out. I didn't add anything. Once truth is spoken, extra words cheapen it. I set my glass on the linen and felt the table's solidity through the cloth, all that wood doing its job over the decades without applause. The Legion trio held their instruments like walking sticks. The banquet manager glanced toward the door, and the door, simple, ordinary, the one we'd all used to come in with our coats and our goodwill, waited like a page in a hymn book before the next verse. Someone opened it. Cool hallway air folded into the warmth of the room, and the candles on the tables leaned their flames toward me, the way plants lean to a window. Shapes crossed the threshold, blocky the color of responsibility. You could not read badges from that distance, but you didn't need to. The stance gives it away, shoulders square, hands empty, and visible eyes practicing calm for other people's sake. Hal followed that movement as if dragged by a wire, his head turning first, then his shoulders, his certainty shredding in invisible strips. I watched his gaze do the math he'd declined to do at the kitchen table. It is a terrible thing to witness a man try to outrun arithmetic. He looked back at me, and in that look I saw the boy. He'd been the salesman he'd practiced becoming, and the hollow where the steward should have lived. I thought about the rules posted in church basements: no smoking, no open flames, no politics, no outside food. I thought about the unwritten rules we'd live by. Keep your word. Don't brag at funerals. Return what you borrow. What walked through the door wasn't vengeance. It was the return policy on the public's trust. I lifted my chin and let the room hold me. "Elaine," he said, trying again for laughter and finding gravel. "What are you doing?" I was doing what women like me have always done when the roof starts to leak during a party. I was catching the drip, moving the bowl, keeping the guests from panic, while the men with ladders pull up. I was choosing calm. I was standing still so people would know where to look for the next right thing. I folded my napkin and laid it neat beside my plate. Then I slipped my hand through Michael's arm and tipped my head toward the door, not for drama but for clarity. The hall breathed in together and waited for the knock you can hear with your eyes, a badge-catching light, a paper, and a protective sleeve, lifted a voice tempered by practice saying a full name in a room suddenly attentive to names. The band leader set his saxophone gently on its stand. The pastor's lips moved without sound. The mothers in the room pressed fingers to their necklaces, each of us locating our own clasp. The door finished opening. The moment finished arriving. The first officer spoke with the practiced steadiness of someone who has said hard words before. He held a paper in a clear sleeve, and I could see the county seal ghosted behind the typed lines. "Harold Parker," he asked. And though the room knew the answer, procedure asked again. Hal tried a smile that had worked on bank managers and golf marshals. "Gentlemen, this is a private event, if you'll let me." The officer continued in a tone that didn't rise or apologize. "Mr. Parker, you're under arrest on suspicion of theft in office securing, writings by deception, and misapplication of public funds." He read the rights, as if every syllable were a rung on a ladder climbable if you put your foot where the law tells you. The room made a sound like a quilt being shaken, gasp, hush, a soft flap of disbelief. I kept my hands folded. Michael's jaw flexed once. David's breath hitched and leveled. The pastor stepped half a pace forward, not to intervene, but to be visible if anyone needed a steady set of eyes. The banquet manager lifted her chin toward the bar, and the bartender set down his towel and simply waited. Good staff can hold a scene together better than most sermons. Elaine, Hal said, half laughing, hunting for a version of me that would step into the old script. "This is a misunderstanding." He angled his body toward me, away from the paper, like a man turning his back on weather. The officer didn't move closer. He didn't need to. "Sir, please place your hands where I can see them." That sentence is a measure of mercy if you hear it right. An invitation to choose dignity while you still can. Tessa reached for Hal's sleeve fingertips, just touching the wool. In public, she had always been about touch claims staked with manicure and perfume. Now her hand hovered and then retreated a quarter inch a tide, learning its limits. She whispered, "Say something," and Hal tried to manufacture a speech. You people!" He gestured vaguely toward the tables, toward the familiar faces that had bought mulch with us on fundraising Saturdays and watched our son's lines of scrimmage. "This is political," he announced, as if the word could knock the legs out from under mathematics. The second officer, younger, took a half step left to open a corridor of space. A third, a woman with her hair pulled back and a ring on a chain at her throat, stood near the doorway, speaking quietly into a radio. I watched their hands because hands tell the truth. Open, visible, patient. They didn't crowd him. They didn't perform. They presented a choice, and when he didn't make it, they made it for him. "Sir, turn around." The words fell without drama. When metal met wrist, there was no movie click, only a small practical sound like a drawer finding home. Hal winced. Not from pain, I think, but because humiliation has nerve endings money can't numb. I saw the exact moment the salesman's grin slid off his face and left the man underneath, a man who had not done the arithmetic, and now found the sum written in public. There is an etiquette to collective shock that church basements teach you. Mrs. Delaney stood and began to pass napkins to the nearest table because hands need jobs. Coach Lang murmured, "Let's give them room," and people scooted their chairs back without scraping. The Legion trio shifted their weight and looked down, instruments cradled like vows. The DJ turned the volume knob to 0, not because music would be wrong, but because silence had work to do. "Ma'am," the woman officer said softly to me, not assuming, not intruding. "Are you okay?" It's a question we ask as a spell to mark a person safe while the echoes are still deciding whether to settle. I said, and heard that it was true. My heart beat in my ears, steady as a kitchen clock in the next room. I found my glass, lifted it, and took a sip because I wanted my mouth to know ordinary again. Tessa aimed herself toward the side door with the hydrangea wreath, her eyes flicking to calculate distance. The younger officer lifted his palm, not blocking, simply introducing a pause. "Ma'am, we'll need to speak with you before you go." Her chin rose in a tiny act of rebellion. "Am I under arrest?" She asked, the words too large for her mouth. "Not at this time," he said, "but we have some questions." Her shoulders dropped a fraction, a balloon losing just enough air to stop looking dangerous. Hal tried anger next. "You don't have anything. This is a stunt." The older officer didn't blink. "We'll talk downtown." He guided Hal a quarter turn clear of the cake table. The pastor, God bless him, put a palm on the cake knife to steady it in its silver cradle, because sometimes ministry is keeping frosting where it belongs. Michael took a breath like he might speak and then didn't. David leaned close enough for me to feel his sleeve against mine. We did not make a scene out of the scene. We made space. "Do you need his wallet?" I asked, and heard the habit in my voice, the old domestic reflex that reaches for practicalities when life spills. The woman officer said, "We'll inventory his belongings at booking." I nodded. "His blood pressure meds are in his left coat pocket," I said, because compassion should not retire when justice clocks in. She wrote that on a small pad, the way nurses write on gloves when they've run out of paper. The officers began to walk Hal toward the door, not rushing, not dragging. The room parted politely. If you want to know the soul of a place, watch how it opens a path. No one jeered. No one clapped. A couple of men removed their ball caps, instinctive respect untethered from approval. The hall seemed to exhale as the cooler air from the corridor found its way to the candle flames, which leaned and then straightened. Halfway to the door, Hal turned his head and called my name. It wasn't the old easy Laney that belonged to summers and car washes. It was the full one, the way your name sounds in a waiting room when the nurse calls you back. "Elaine," he said, bewilderment spilling out now that swagger had found the exit. I stepped one pace forward so he could see me without twisting. "Take care of the boys," he said, as if they were young or as if I ever stopped. I kept my voice low. "They take care of themselves," I said. "You take care of the truth." Outside, tires hissed on wet pavement. The parking lot had gathered a skin of drizzle while we were inside, and a train horn far off stitched the moment to every other evening our town has ever known. The officers eased Hal through the doorway, and the banquet manager let it swing shut with ceremony like the last page of a book. The room's volume rose 2 notches and then settled the way birds do after a hawk passes. Tessa stood at the edge of the dance floor color, leaving her face by careful degrees. She reached into her purse and found nothing she needed. I watched her search for a version of herself that could survive fluorescent light. When the woman officer approached, Tessa's chin wobbled. I didn't know she said, and I believed her and didn't. Most of us know enough to be responsible for the rest. The officer guided her toward a quieter corner near the coat racks. They sat on folding chairs that had seen potlucks in election day lines, and the ordinary metal held the weight of her new story without complaint. The pastor came to my side. "Would you like to pray?" he asked, offering the liturgy that gets us through births and surgeries and farm auctions. "In a minute," I said. "First, I need to make sure nobody faints." He smiled, understanding that in our town, triage is neighborly. He took the mic and cleared his throat gently. "Friends," he said, "let's give the staff a moment to reset. If you need fresh air, the side patio is open. Coffee is hot. We'll cut the cake shortly." He did not try to interpret the evening. He did what good shepherds do. He kept the flock from scattering. I walked to the kitchen pass-through and thanked the dishwashers for their patience, because gratitude is a way to call yourself back to your feet. The head server, a woman with salt and pepper hair and a tattoo of a small anchor on her wrist, touched my arm. "You held up," she said, not as compliment but as witness. I said, "So did you." She poured me a fresh cup and tucked 2 sugar packets beside it, the kind of kindness that doesn't ask questions. When I stepped onto the side patio, the night met me with the smell of damp leaves and cold metal. A couple of neighbors stood near the railing, murmuring small talk about the high school's playoff chances. The football field 2 blocks away threw its light up into the low clouds, and for a second I pictured the band in plumes and the lanky kicker's careful steps. Life does not pause. It swerves around you with courtesy and continues. I breathed in and out until my shoulders lowered from around my ears. Back inside, someone had turned the slideshow back on without sound. Photographs washed the wall with our younger faces. People watched like museum goers, not trying to fix anything, only honoring the fact that it existed. The Legion Trio, after a glance from the pastor, lifted their instruments and played Moon River so softly it felt like a benediction hummed from the corner. The notes walked unhurried to the places in the room that needed them most. The cake waited. The banquet manager approached with the knife and a question in her eyes. I nodded. We cut it. I served Mrs. Delaney a slice with extra frosting and handed Coach Lang an end piece because he likes the crisp edge of things. Michael took plates to the far tables. David refilled water pitchers. Tessa was still in the corner with the officer answering questions in a voice I barely recognized. When she looked up and saw me, she seemed to search for anger on my face and didn't find it. I had put anger down hours ago to make room for resolve. A few guests left early, hugging me with awkward tenderness, promises to call embroidered on their goodbyes. Many stayed. We told harmless stories. We laughed at good lines. We let the room be what rooms like that are built to be, containers for community, for grief that knows its neighbors' names. When the band finished the soft set, the DJ put on a quiet track, nothing with a beat, just something to give people a place to put their eyes that wasn't on the door. By 10:30, the hall looked like any party near its end, crumbs, napkins folded into boats, centerpiece, sprigs, tucking into purses. I thanked the staff again, tipped them too much, and stood with the pastor at the doorway as the last guests stepped into the night. You were kind, he said. So were they. I answered and meant the officers and the neighbors, and even in a way, the candles which had stood their posts without complaint. When the lights came up, the parquet shone. I gathered my purse and the envelope with our deposit slip for the room rental refund. The boys carried boxes to the car. We loaded the trunk. The folder already there, like a blanket you keep because winter's return. At the curb, the night smelled like wet oak and cooling engines. Somewhere a porch light clicked on the ordinary mercy of a bulb doing its basic work. I slid behind the wheel and set my hands at 10 and 2 the way the rulebook taught me when I was 16 in a borrowed sedan. Michael leaned down to the window. You okay, Mom? I smiled, tired and certain. I am, I said. Let's go home. The boys climbed into their own cars and we pulled away 3 sets of taillights, threading through a town that had held us through better nights and would hold us through this one. In the rear view, the hall receded, and with it the part of my life that mistook applause for love. In the weeks after the party, the town behaved the way decent towns do after a storm. It picked up branches without asking who owned them. People left pies on my porch without notes. The senior center sent me home with a quart of chili and 3 crossword puzzles paper clipped together. At church, the ushers added tissues to the end of every pew as if sorrow were a cold going around. Mrs. Delaney pressed my hands and didn't try to translate anything into lessons. I'm making soup, she said. You want carrots or potatoes? I said both, and we both understood we were speaking about more than soup. The county released statements with careful language. Alleged investigation, ongoing presumption of innocence. The paper ran a column on stewardship and public trust without using Hal's name. People nodded to me in the produce aisle, and then pretended to study apples. I learned how kindness looks when it doesn't know where to put its eyes. I wore my navy coat and my mother's scarf and bought the same cereal I've bought for 20 years. It mattered to me that the everyday keep its promise. Michael stopped by to salt my steps when the first freeze hit. He didn't bring up the party. He asked about the gutter over the garage, which has a stubborn drip. David called after his night shifts to make sure I'd slept. When I told him I'd scrubbed the kitchen floor at 3 a.m, he said maybe leave one corner dirty so you know where to start next time. We laughed the kind of laugh that knows what it's doing, pulling the body back from the ledge into the ordinary room where coffee still brews and the dog still yawns mid-stretch. The prosecutor's office asked me to review a timeline. I poured coffee into a travel mug and walked up 2 flights of courthouse stairs because habit makes your legs honest. I sat across from a legal pad that had grown new colors of tabs. The retired detective nodded at me like a colleague and slid a sheet across, dates, transfers, invoices, signatures, that broke promises in conservative ink. You did good work, he said. I said I wrote down what was true. He said most people don't. When the indictment came, it landed like weather. The forecast had warned us about all week, no surprise, still bracing. The charges had names heavy enough to dent a table theft in office, tampering with records, engaging in a pattern of corrupt activity. Tessa's name appeared only in the narrative, a passerby to money she hadn't handled. I felt a complicated relief. It is possible to tell the truth about a thing without burning down every house on the block. Word traveled as it does. A neighbor's text, a phone call from Ruth. You saw I said I had. We didn't say much more. At our age, we've learned the difference between processing and poking a bruise. That night, I made grilled cheese and tomato soup and ate at the counter with the radio low. The dog put her chin on my knee the way she did when the boys came home sick from third grade, and I scratched the velvet space between her ears until we both remembered how comfort works. I found myself grieving odd smallnesses. The screwdriver drawer that Hal always left open a crack. The scuff on the garage step from his work boots. The way he whistled off-key when he watered the lawn and thought he was being helpful about it. You can love the habits and still reject the harm. I cleaned the screwdriver drawer, labeled the bits, and shut it all the way. When I caught myself reaching for a second coffee mug, I set it down and let the single one stand. People asked quietly if I felt humiliated. I didn't. I felt tired, then lighter. Humiliation requires you to believe you are smaller because someone has behaved small toward you. I felt the opposite. The party had revealed the size of my spine, not the size of my wound. When I stood at the sink washing the Dutch oven, I saw my face in the kitchen window at dusk and recognized the woman there, older, around the mouth. Yes, but steadier. I thought of the maple, by the porch shedding leaves at its right time and not in a hurry. Tessa moved out of her townhouse 2 weeks later. I know because I saw the rental van back to the curb and 2 men carry out the picture frames with family in block letters. She didn't come to say anything to me. I didn't expect her to. At the UPS store, I ran into her, once barefaced, eyes unarmored. I didn't know about the money, she said, and there was no victory in her voice, only the dull newness of consequences. You didn't want to, I said, not cruelly. She nodded and turned the envelope in her hands. We both stood there a second, 2 women whose bodies knew the map of the same man for different reasons. And then the clerk called the next number, and the spell broke. The practical work of rebuilding has its own calendar. I went through the accounts with a fine-toothed comb and a pencil canceled cards, closed 1 line of credit, opened a new one in my own name. I called the insurance agent and asked foolish, sensible questions. I met with my lawyer about the house and the business, about what it means to be married to a man who forgot what a steward is. None of it felt courageous. It felt like learning a new recipe with ingredients you already own, patience-less phone calls made before noon, a refusal to be rushed. One afternoon, I found the bracelet Hal had given me in its velvet box at the back of the safe deposit drawer. It glittered the way money tries to impersonate sunlight. I took it to the jeweler, who resets tiny stones with a loop and a lamp he refuses to replace. He looked at it and said, "We can consign." I said I'd like to pay part of Michael's student loan. He wrote a receipt and offered me a peppermint from a bowl by the register. I left lighter by an ounce of diamonds and heavier by an ounce of pride. The town began to relax around me again. Women at church stopped speaking in weather. They asked about the dog, about Roos Cold, about whether I'd tried the new diner with the good pie crust. I taught a budget class at the senior center with the retired detective and watched faces brighten when the arithmetic added up. A widow in the front row said, "I wish I'd heard this before," and I told her the kindness no one tells early enough. It's not your fault you trusted. That's the point of trust. I went to the football field on a Friday night and sat on the cold bleachers, wrapped in a blanket with our school's colors. The band marched in straight lines and turned corners clean. The kicker's careful steps found their mark. When the crowd sang along to the fight song, I sang off-key like Hal used to whistle, and no one minded. Community does not ask for perfect pitch. It asks for presence. As winter settled, the house began to feel like mine in new ways. I rearranged the pantry, moved the good glasses to a lower shelf, and donated 3 useless gadgets we'd been given at a white elephant party the year the boys were in high school. I painted the laundry room a soft green that made February feel less like a dare. I hung a small corkboard by the back door and pinned a card with 3 verbs written in black marker: breathe, write, walk. On mornings when grief ambushed me in the cereal aisle or the church parking lot, I came home and did those 3. There were days it hurt like a tooth that will not be satisfied until you see a dentist. On those days, I drove to the reservoir and watched the thin ice form and unform along the edge. I said out loud in the car. What I was proud of, I did not scream at the party. I told the truth. I fed people. I kept the receipts. Saying it aloud made my chest feel less like a locked drawer and more like a window you remember you can open. Michael asked if I would ever forgive Hal. Forgiveness isn't a door I control, I said. It's a direction I can face. He nodded the way men nod when they're practicing being gentle with themselves. David asked if I'd ever date. I laughed and told him I'd rather buy a new dishwasher and call it romance. He laughed too and offered to help me install it, which is the Parker way of saying we know how to love what can be fixed. The day a letter arrived with a court date printed near the top, I set it on the counter and made tea. I did not announce it to the dog or text Ruth immediately. I stood at the sink and watched the kettle steam the window. Then I sat, opened a fresh page in my spiral notebook and wrote the date in my careful hand. I listed what I could control: shoes with quiet soles, gas in the car, a snack in my purse in case things run long, a prayer small enough to fit in my pocket. Let me be decent. On Sunday, the pastor preached about Advent, about waiting, without slipping into despair. We think waiting is empty, he said, but waiting is preparation. I thought about how long I had waited before I started writing things down and how the waiting had been doing its quiet work on me the whole time, teaching me to see patterns, to breathe through insult, to be the woman who can speak one clean line into a microphone without adding more than the moment requires. I don't walk around consumed by the story. I carry it the way you carry a scar under a sleeve, present, not busy. I buy stamps. I make soup. I pinch back the basil so it grows fuller. I answer the phone. When people ask how I am, I say good days and hard ones, and that is true enough to be useful. On the good ones, I let myself notice the way afternoon light throws a rectangle on the kitchen floor. On the hard ones, I feed the dog and move my body on purpose until sleep has something to work with. If you expect a flourish here, there isn't one. There is a town still plowing its streets, a choir still practicing on Wednesday nights, a woman in a navy coat checking the sump pump before the thaw. There is dignity, which is not loud, and mercy which arrives disguised as habit. There is the quiet satisfaction of arithmetic that balances in the even quieter relief of being believed. There is a life to be lived, less applause, more truth, and I am living it. The courthouse smelled like old paper and floor wax, the same way it did when I paid the dog license every January. I wore my quiet shoes and brought a granola bar in my purse because hearings never start on time. In the hallway, I saw a bulletin board with flyers for parenting classes, a community coat drive, and a blood pressure clinic on Tuesdays. Justice, like everything else in town, shares space with reminders to take care of yourself. When they called the case, I felt the way I feel when a cold front finally arrives after days of pressure. Something invisible releases. Hal stood at the defense table in a suit I recognized, thinner than it used to be, color high and uneven in his cheeks. He did not look at me. He looked at the judge, a woman with efficient hair and the kind of reading glasses that say this won't take longer than it must. The prosecutor read counts, the defense asked for time, and the judge set dates. No fireworks, just the dull, important thud of procedure flooring itself into place. On the way out, a reporter asked if I had a comment. I said I trust the process and kept walking. That sentence used to sound like a dodge to me, the thing people say when they don't know what else to say. Now it felt like an anchor. The process, for all its imperfections, had held me up. Paper signatures, people who showed up because their job is to show up. I sat in my car with both hands on the wheel and let myself breathe until the sting behind my eyes receded. That night I made meatloaf with ketchup glaze and mashed potatoes, with too much butter comfort food that has never asked me to explain myself. I set 3 plates, then laughed and put one back. Michael and David came anyway, stepping through the back door like they grew up doing, and we ate too much and washed dishes elbow to elbow. When the sink drained with that satisfying whoosh, Michael said, "I keep thinking of the slideshow," and David said, "I keep thinking of the cake." I said, "I keep thinking of the napkins," and we laughed, the kind that loosens shoulders. Spring arrived in stubborn fits. I raked leaves that had waited out the snow and found a handful of acorns sprouting tiny promises. I turned soil in the raised bed Ruth helped me build years ago and planted those heirloom tomato seeds. She gave me the ones she swore would taste like August. The retired detective stopped by the senior center table where I was labeling envelopes for bingo prizes and tapped his knuckles like punctuation. Pre-trial next week, he said, not to stir fear, but to keep me inside the truth's calendar. I nodded, Ordinary tasks and court dates took turns. In pretrial, there were negotiations I did not attend. My lawyer called afterward and explained words that sound like broomstraw restitution plea conditions. It won't feel like victory, she warned, because justice usually feels like work finished, not fireworks. When she hung up, I wrote a check to the PTA for the music program and scheduled my mammogram. It's a strange kind of sanity to keep two lists legal in life and cross items off both with the same pen. One afternoon, I saw Tessa at the pharmacy. No lipstick this time, hair pulled back with a clip you buy near the register. She hesitated, then said, "I took a job in Columbus. I move in June." I told her I hoped it would be good for her. She swallowed. He told me I helped him feel alive. I said, "Some men confuse attention with oxygen." She nodded like that sentence untied a knot somewhere inside her. We didn't hug. We did not need a scene. We stood there in the aisle between the vitamin D and the glucose monitors and let ordinary mercy do its quiet, modest job. Sentencing came on a rainy Monday. People think it will feel cinematic. Mostly it felt like sitting up straight on a hard bench while a clerk reads numbers. The judge spoke about stewardship and the public's money, about how small thefts add up to big betrayals, about how a town's trust is a living thing in the care of its officials. She sentenced Hal to prison time and restitution plus community service when he returns. He nodded once as if he had expected to be spared, and the nod was the last of that expectation blowing out. Afterward, I didn't go home right away. I drove to the reservoir and watched the wind fret the surface into 1,000 small shivers. I thought about the day I put the shoebox on the table, about the way lemon bars steadied strangers into colleagues, about my single sentence, spoken into a microphone under a chandelier. None of it felt like triumph. It felt like sobriety, the kind that lets you hold your head level in a grocery line and ask for paper instead of plastic without your throat tightening. People ask me if I've forgiven him. Sometimes they lower their voices as if forgiveness were contraband. I say I'm walking in that direction. Some days I make it to the end of the block. Some days I get to the mailbox and wave at the neighbor and go inside. I do not carry stones in my pockets. I plant tomatoes. I recycle glass. I take casseroles to new widowers and sit long enough to let them talk about the way their houses sound different at night. The house has learned my steps. I fixed the drip over the garage myself after watching a video twice, and when the ladder wobbled, I climbed down and waited for Michael because wisdom is the better part of bravery. I replaced the dishwasher and felt ridiculous joy the first time it hummed without complaint. I put a lamp on a timer so the living room decides sunset for itself. I sit on the porch some evenings with a sweater and listen to the neighborhood decide what's for dinner. At church, I return to the choir second alto, where I have always belonged, not the high notes, not the melody, the line that makes harmony possible. We practiced an old hymn and found ourselves crying on the third verse because we could suddenly hear our mother's voices there and because endurance has its own tune. The pastor asked me to speak at the senior center about keeping records and keeping your head. I told them the 3 verbs on the corkboard by my back door: breathe, write, walk. I told them that truth doesn't need volume, just daylight. Sometimes I pass the Knights of Columbus Hall on my way to the library and think about that night. I don't flinch. I picture Mrs. Delaney passing napkins, the pastor steadying the cake knife, the officer's open hands, my son standing like porch posts. I remember the band playing Moon River as if they were stitching torn fabric. That night wasn't my ruin. It was my renovation. I didn't become a new person. I was revealed as the woman I had been practicing to be all along. If you're listening because someone humiliated you in a room that used to feel safe, hear me. You are not small. Stand up. Speak one clean sentence. Let the room do what it will do. Then go home, make supper, and keep your notes. Call your sister. Take your meds. Put on your quiet shoes and show up for the unglamorous tasks that make a life. Justice rarely sparkles, but it holds. And if you have been the one doing harm, I hope you hear this too. Find the receipts. Tell the truth before the knock on the door. Return what isn't yours. The day you start walking toward decency is the day the room gets brighter for everyone. I'm going to keep telling stories like this, not because I love scandal, but because I love the way ordinary courage sounds when it finally remembers its own name. If this story gave you steadiness, would you share it with someone who needs a hand to hold? If it reminded you of a time community carried you, I hope you'll subscribe so we can keep company here quietly. Honestly, with enough light for the next right step.